The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The UN is now making a claim and issuing a warning about Ebola that has some people scared, and it has others questioning whether the UN knows what they're talking about. And the claim from the UN is that Ebola must be controlled within 60 days, or else the world faces what they're calling an unprecedented situation for which there is no plan. They say that the disease is running faster than us, and that it is winning the race. Over 9,000 or almost 9,000 cases of Ebola have been reported so far in West Africa, nearly 4,500 deaths. The WHO has also advised that we need to ensure within 60 days that 70% of infected people are in a care facility and 70% of burials are done without causing further infection. We're going to talk about the burials a little bit later, but as far as these numbers go, Lewis, what's your sense of what the UN is saying here? Do you think this may be some slightly exaggerated fear-mongering, or do you buy it?
I don't see, this is one of those situations in which I don't see the harm in fear-mongering, because if we are ambivalent about this, it could be disastrous.
You could make the argument when we first talked about Ebola back on June 27th, if there had been more fear then, maybe some of this could have been prevented. At the same time, we're not really advocating propagandistic fear-mongering, but we're saying that people should be aware of what could happen, and maybe that would create some kind of a catalyst to actually act more quickly or earlier.
There are experts who are saying that this isn't nearly as big a deal as the UN is saying, and then the UN and several World Health Organizations are saying that this is a really big deal. It seems like more experts are saying that this is a huge problem that we need to solve right now. And so we shouldn't play the false equivalency game.
Meanwhile, there's been a second transmission in Texas, a second healthcare worker at Texas Health Presbyterian who has presumably caught Ebola from Thomas Eric Duncan. That patient, the first who was diagnosed within the U.S., was treated in Dallas and subsequently died over the weekend. We now have two individuals who have contracted Ebola, presumably from Thomas Eric Duncan. Authorities continuing to track. It's gone from 70 now to about 75 people following the second hospital worker's diagnosis. Right now, I think the best news in terms of feeling that we can handle this and we can get this under control is that in spite of the fact that in Guinea, in Liberia, and in Sierra Leone, we have significant outbreak, the neighboring countries there that are in relatively close proximity are not having uncontrolled spread of Ebola. And this should reinforce the idea that this can be gotten under control. We can get this under control. The US, of course, and other countries, key airport hubs in Europe, are the recipients of much more travel from people that have been in these countries, in fact, relative to these other small countries around them in Africa. But this should be at least positive in the sense that it doesn't have to continue spreading.
Well, just because it hasn't hit those adjacent countries doesn't mean it won't. And I think it could very easily. So, a month from now, who knows? It's terrifying.
So we've talked a little bit about the burial issue, and we know that in Liberia, there is significant contact between those who are handling a funeral or burial service and the dead. And that this is one of the most risky ways, one of the most simple and straightforward ways in which Ebola can be transferred from one to another. And there's some very disturbing reporting from Vice about what's going on. During wakes in Liberia, friends and relatives pay their respects customarily by touching and kissing the corpse of the deceased individual. And obviously this is a disaster. This should not be happening. And because of the bodies being highly contagious, if the individual died from Ebola or had Ebola and died from something else for some reason, there has been an effort in Liberia to, when there is an Ebola-related death, to prevent that traditional burial process and instead to cremate, which is not something that is typically done in Liberia. And unfortunately, according to Peter Pio from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, he gave an interview where he expressed significant alarm, saying that there have actually been many individuals in Liberia that are bribing health officials to lie on the death certificate so that Ebola is not shown as the cause of death, which subsequently allows them to do this traditional funeral ritual. If this is true, and we have certainly a couple of corroborating stories suggesting it is, and nothing in particular saying that it is not, this is a real problem, Lewis. And you've talked to us on the bonus show about some of the skepticism towards Western knowledge on Ebola in Africa, and it has actually led to violence when individuals come and try to actually teach locals about what this is and how it's transmitted. This is really not a good thing, because this is not going to allow the containment within Liberia.
I think this comes down to education. If these countries had better education, would health officials even be allowing this to happen? Would families even be asking for this at all? Would they even try to bribe this? Would they want to kiss the corpse of someone who died from Ebola? I would say probably not, and I can't imagine that ever happening here.
Well, I don't know. I mean, we have some pretty crazy stuff that happens here as well, but we can save that, I guess, for another day. There is a recent Wall Street Journal article that says $40 to $150 seems to be the going rate for bribing a health official to lie about the cause of death on the birth certificate. What do we do? I don't know. I mean, Lewis, as you've told us, we've tried to send people over to explain the logistics, and weren't some of those individuals killed?
There was a health team that was slaughtered by villagers with machetes and whatnot when they were trying to spread information and awareness about Ebola. Yes.
What do we do? I mean,
what do we do? I don't know what you do. Sometimes people are still in denial even when they see a loved one stricken with this illness, because they think that it was I don't know, given to them by someone who wanted to spread the disease, and that it's not transmittable. It's a disaster. Maybe you just let it take its course. I don't know.
We continue to learn more and more about what is happening with ISIS and this fight against ISIS that is taking place. The bad news is that ISIS does seem to be advancing further and taking control of additional cities. The further bad news is that this seems like it will be a multi-year engagement, a multi-year process. President Obama warned that the battle against ISIS will take time. From the New York Times, President Obama on Tuesday predicted, quote, periods of progress and setbacks in the war against Islamic militants in Iraq and Syria, as he sought to demonstrate a unity of purpose during an unusual face-to-face meeting with senior military chiefs from 21 nations. Meanwhile, ISIS has advanced in Anbar. Al-Assad's Hamza Mustafa said despite suffering setbacks elsewhere in Iraq, ISIS continues to advance in the country's western Anbar province. ISIS seized an Iraqi military camp in Hit on Monday after Iraqi forces carried out what it termed a tactical retreat from the area. Tactical retreat meaning they were probably not going to win that engagement, and they decided to get out of there in order to cut their losses. Iraqi military officials claim to have removed equipment and arms from the base, in addition to burning food supplies in order to deny ISIS fighters any provisions. This is increasingly likely to become an issue in the 2016 election. And if this continues to go several years, and it very well may from all indications we have now, we are going to see this become a serious issue during the 2016 debates and election. Now, Lewis, this may be a good thing, not that this is an engagement that's taking a while, but in terms of the 2016 election, because the distinguishing factor sometimes in primaries, particularly on the Republican side, is foreign policy. And you'll remember that foreign policy often has this ability to kind of distinguish the adults from the children in the room. When Sarah Palin was asked about foreign policy back when she was John McCain's running mate, she said something about, you can see Russia from Alaska, so something about her foreign policy experience. So this may be a good thing in the sense that during the primaries, if this is still an issue, and there's every indication that it will be, candidates will have to talk about ISIS and talk about foreign policy, and that should more quickly allow us to discern who has even the most remote connection to reality in terms of foreign policy and who is just kind of guessing.
It allows us to discern that, but does it allow your average American to discern it? That's another question. I don't know, but certainly it will create some separation. I still predict that issues like immigration will be much more prominent than this, but I hope it's discussed.
We also need to consider, is Ebola going to be an issue in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election? If it is, then that's really going to be a sign that things have not gone well. As we know, with the kind of exponential spread of disease that often takes place, if Ebola is still an issue in, I don't know, February, March or April of 2016, then that's a really bad sign. Remember those anti-gay Benham twins? These are the guys that were going to have some kind of reality TV show about either home repair or interior decoration, or I don't even remember what it was. Anyway, they made some anti-gay bigoted statements, of course, based merely on their sincerely held religious beliefs. And I believe it was HGTV said, we're not going to give you this show. They are now claiming that they are just like the victims of ISIS. Now, as we've talked about on this program before, the extremely religious Christians are actually more in line with the points of view of ISIS than those who are just hoping for LGBT equality when it comes to subjugation of women, homophobia, a religious-based legal and judicial and cultural system in the country, so on and so forth. That didn't stop the Benham twins from telling fellow bigot Tony Perkins that they are like the victims of ISIS. Here's what they had to say.
David and I always say first that this is a spiritual battle. That from the outset, there was a war in heaven, and now it's manifesting itself here on this earth. We see the struggle between good and evil, light and darkness, truth and lies. I mean, if we don't admit to that, and we look at ISIS and what's happening over in the Middle East, then we've got our head buried under a rock. I mean, we're just denying reality. But with what's happening with swords over in the Middle East is happening with silence over here in America. The exact same agenda in the form of silence. That's their weapon. And Jason and I were targeted. And it's a very well orchestrated, well-oiled machine that comes after us. Now, you can have beliefs all you want, but you can't voice those beliefs. You voice biblical opinions and biblical beliefs, specifically marriage between a man and a woman, specifically unborn children are human beings. You begin to voice those opinions, and then you're going to be targeted.
Talk about boldness. They have that boldness. But one thing he said that it captivated me. In the Middle East, they use the sword. In here, they use silence. But in both ways, the voice of Christians are lost.
They're being targeted. How exactly is being disagreed with being targeted, Lewis?
I'm not sure. You know what? I think we should hand them over to ISIS to give them some actual perspective on this.
They're saying, you know, we're these poor, persecuted Christians. We got fired from our national TV show, and a national community of religious conservative bigots rallied behind us in support, effectively eliminating any actual negative repercussions from getting fired from our national TV show that was going to pay us tons of money. I feel so bad for them, Lewis. They're really being scapegoated.
Yeah, poor guys. I'm serious though. Let's hand them over to ISIS.
Obviously, I assume you're being facetious, but they lost a job here, not because they were being targeted, but because their for-profit employer decided these points of view are really bad for business. And as an individual private business, we're going to decide not to give these guys a bigger platform, given the fact that they're anti-gay bigots.
Yeah, it was a business decision and the correct decision. And this is the same type of thing we've heard from other people in similar situations. They think that their rights are being trampled. They think that they're being persecuted because of their religion. And it's just nonsense. They have no perspective. They have no clue about what is happening in other parts of the world.
In fact, they're using their religion as a shield for their persecution of others, in particular LGBT individuals, or as they mentioned, those who choose to have legal medical procedures that they believe are against their religion, they're the ones using their religion to persecute. They're not being persecuted. Join our Reddit discussion forum. Go to davidpakman.com/Reddit. That's REDDIT. We'll be back right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is made possible in part by liberalbias.com. Liberalbias.com is producing a new weekly video feature on their YouTube channel, Liberal Bias Video. To get the latest updates on how to uncover liberal bias in the world, subscribe to Liberal Bias Video on YouTube. Today's new member of the day is Roy Chitwood. Roy Chitwood, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. Roy is supporting our show, voting with his dollars, and that's really what we depend on. So if you've been watching, if you've been listening, if you value what we do, please think about becoming a member. It doesn't cost much. Go to davidpakman.com/membership. Lewis, people know that today is a day for Hatriot Mail.
Because it's God's divine plan that every child be born, but an act of patriotic duty to snuff that bastard if he sets a foot near your stuff. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
That's really one of my favorite introductions. I love that one. Okay, this week's Hatriot Mail, it goes back to the obsession people seem to have with the idea that Lewis is in a gay relationship with me or vice versa, or that we're together in some way. They of course, that seems to be a popular way to criticize the show, as if we were gay and in a relationship with each other, what we said would be much less valid or something like that. I don't even know what the point is of including that, but nevertheless, it is often included. Let's listen to this week's Hatriot Mail.
Pakman, do you not even have a clues about Eric Holder's corruption? How the hell can you do a show without doing the necessary research? Basically, most of your shows make no sense, nor do they have any legitimate merit because of your lack of education. Maybe you should put your boyfriend Lewis in charge, huh? Lol.
Oh man, that is a good one. Lewis, we don't have a clues.
We don't. That is a good one. It's yeah. I mean, it's mild, but it gets a point across.
Yes, it certainly does. And I think that there's probably somewhat of a split in terms of why the references are to Lewis being my boyfriend. One part of it is probably the idea that if someone is gay, you just can't trust them, right? Anything they say, you have to write off. And the other part may be that some people maybe have that fantasy, Lewis. They've significantly repressed their homosexuality, and this is a way to kind of couch their desires, their fantasies, as a sort of criticism.
There have been some Hatriot Mails where there is some very descriptive stuff going on, people with vivid imaginations, and it really makes you wonder.
Yes, it certainly does. Last night, the New York Times reporting on the decision from the Supreme Court to allow Texas abortion clinics to stay open. There had been some state initiatives to close most of the, or actually, let me rephrase, all of the abortion clinics in Texas that were south of San Antonio and west of San Antonio. That as kind of the key point there. And had this law been allowed to stand, there would only have been 8 abortion clinics left. Many women would have needed to travel more than 150 miles to the nearest abortion provider. The decision from the Supreme Court, 5 sentences long, no explanation, simply that they are going to allow the Texas abortion clinics to stay open. Abortion rights advocates said this was a good decision. Those who pushed for the closure of these abortion clinics in Texas said that this was a bad decision. We need to think about this in the simplest possible terms. Sometimes we need nuance, right? But sometimes we need to do an analysis that is simple, that is really going to illuminate what the best course forward is. If you get pregnant, okay, and you're determined to have an abortion, will you easily be swayed not to have that abortion because you have to drive a long way to the nearest abortion clinic? No. Most people, most women, if they're determined not to birth that child, are either just going to drive, right? It'll be annoying, but they'll just make the drive. Or, I hate to use the term back alley abortion, but it's representative of the problem with banning abortion clinics, which is that women will figure out how to terminate the pregnancy on their own, by the way, in ways that could be dangerous to them and or will lead to significant additional healthcare costs. So it's just obvious at its face, Lewis, that this is not the way to reduce the number of abortions.
No, I guess the idea is that by not allowing this to happen, you are doing the right thing, and that if a woman chooses to find her own ways of doing it, well, you can't be held responsible for that. The state can't be held responsible.
But if your imperative is a moral one, right, which is that of saving the lives of unborn children, as we often hear characterized by the right, then you should still care, right? You should still care, because whether it's a proper, legal, safe abortion, or whether it's a woman figuring out how to terminate a pregnancy, you should care equally, and you should seek to reduce both of those situations. And the way we do that, Lewis, is obvious. Full comprehensive sex education, access to contraception, and that's the best thing you can do to reduce the number of abortions.
It is. But like I've said before, opponents of this, opponents of reality, we could say, just live in ignorant bliss, thinking they're doing the right thing and that it works when they pull it off.
News from MSNBC from the world of corporate media. Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes both are seeing their lowest ratings in history since they've started their programs. Rachel Maddow is having her lowest ratings in the history of her program. During the third quarter, Rachel Maddow reached an average of 183,000 viewers in the most important audience component, which is viewers between the ages of 25 and 54. That's her lowest total since 2008 when the show started. An executive from MSNBC, who asked not to be identified, said, "The format has grown tired. In terms of Rachel, everybody knows every night what she's going to say. The network just doesn't surprise you." The newest primetime host, Chris Hayes, also hit new lows in the third quarter, averaging just 129,000 viewers in this 25 to 54 category, his worst since his program began in the second quarter of 2013. Some people, okay, I have actually a lot of thoughts on this. Some people are saying that this is because Rachel Maddow's show has become predictable in terms of the format, like this executive. Others are saying Chris Hayes was just never really a good choice. I've been saying for years and years that I don't know if this format is the best way to get progressive messages across, right? This format where you read the show off of a teleprompter, the full show has been scripted. You're basically kind of talking at the audience. Interviews that are so tightly planned that after question one, almost no matter what the answer is from the guest, you've got to figure out a way to get to question two, because the entire interview has already been predetermined and it's not really a real conversation. And much of this has nothing to do with Rachel Maddow or Chris Hayes. It has to do with the corporate media structure. It has to do with how MSNBC dictates that the program be produced. I don't know that this is the best format, Lewis, and this is not a critique of any individual. I like Chris Hayes. I like Rachel Maddow. I agree with their politics, broadly speaking. I've met Rachel Maddow a couple of times. I've never met Chris Hayes. I'm sure he's just as lovely as she is. I think this is more about whether the future of progressive media is in this type of program on this type of network. And I don't know that it is. I've been saying for years that I don't think it is.
Unfortunately, I don't think it is either. This type of format does work wonderfully if it is a funny show, like the Colbert Report, or Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, or The Daily Show. I mean, that is essentially the same format, except it works. I don't know. I guess just because it's funny, just because it's humorous, and that's, fast paced, whatever. But yes, clearly the numbers here are obvious, and shows like this just don't last. I mean, how many shows just like this have been on the air for 10, 15 years?
Yeah, I mean, you've got Hardball, but that has a little bit different of a feel, no question about that. You have the O'Reilly Factor, which has its own kind of cult of personality and appeal. Yeah, I don't know. Send me your thoughts on this. What is really the future of corporate media? Is it programs like these in prime time on MSNBC? I don't know. Maybe you think it is. Stay with us, davidpakman.com/membership to become a member today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Professor Bill Bowring, who is Professor of Law at the Birkbeck University of London, also author of Law, Rights, and Ideology in Russia, Landmarks in the Destiny of a Great Power. It's really great to have you on, and I think a lot of our audience is very aware of the last 2 to 4 to maybe 10 years of history in Russia. They're, of course, following, as we are, some of the moves that have been made by Vladimir Putin. But most people don't have a sense of how, going all the way back several hundred years, what we're seeing today in Russia connects to an ideology and a framework from years past. So let's start laying it out as broadly as possible. What was the catalyst, as you may call it, that set Russia on the path which we're now observing?
Well, I'd like to go back to the 16th century when you had Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV in Moscow, and Queen Elizabeth I in England. And actually, that's when you have the beginning of Russia, Moscow and then Russia, as a great continental empire, and the beginning of England as a worldwide maritime empire. That was really England's defeat of the Spanish. And what a lot of people don't know is that Ivan the Terrible proposed marriage to Elizabeth I, and she told him to get lost. But something which I often stress is that England and Russia have been on the same side of practically every war, with the exception of the Crimean War. And in fact, the two empires grew in a way which didn't really lead to conflict, because Russia was spreading across the Eurasian continent, Britain was spreading around the world through sea power. And both Russia and Britain are suffering at the present moment from a deep psychological trauma, which is the loss of empire in the really quite recent past.
And is that what you feel is today a great driver or catalyst for the more, we have these kind of conflicting sides within Russia, right? There's the westernizers, and as we saw, that was certainly a big issue in the conflict with Ukraine and involving Crimea. And then you have those who are more kind of the Slavophiles, or the I don't know what other term there may be. But for a long time, there have been these two camps, have there not?
Well, I would say the ideology of the present regime in Russia, the ideology, is that what unites Putin and the people around him is that they want Russia to be a great power and to be recognized and respected as such around the world. So I would say the Russian leadership see the world in geopolitical terms, and therefore the interpretation of what's been happening in Ukraine from the Russian regime's point of view is that Russia is encircled by the United States and its allies, and Ukraine was really a step too far for NATO in particular. So I think that's not the only factor, but I think that explains quite a bit of the way that the Russian regime has been acting.
I find it very interesting that with some countries, there is a kind of less circuitous history with regard to the direction that the country has gone in than Russia. And if you look, of course, we have in World War II Russia's influence with the Allies, and we know about that. But even going back further, during the 1860s, we saw the abolition of serfdom. We saw the introduction of the jury trial. I mean, these were reforms that we saw in Russia that may not necessarily always be associated with the kind of public face of Vladimir Putin today.
I think this is extremely important. And actually, Alexander II abolished serfdom in 1861, several years before the United States abolished slavery. And why did he do that, which was a massive step? It was because Russia had been defeated in the Crimean War by Britain and France. And that was just a huge shock, because after the defeat of Napoleon, we tend to forget that the Russian army marched all the way to Paris, defeating Napoleon on the way. So after 1812, they arrived in Paris in 1814, marched through Paris in extremely good order, and went home again, having done the job. So Russia, after 1814, thought it was invincible. And then to lose the Crimean War not very many years later, that was a massive shock. And so we had the huge legal reforms, and in fact, jury trial, introduced in 1864 throughout the whole of the Russian Empire. That continued right up until 1917. And one of the big steps in Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union has been the reintroduction of jury trial throughout Russia. And we also tend to forget that Putin, in the first 3 years that he was president, so up until he arrested Mr. Khodorkovsky in 2003, he actually cited the great legal reformers of the 19th century and presented himself as being the heir of Alexander II. So, and that went into reverse. The other side, of course, of what Putin was doing between 2000 and 2003 was the Second Chechen War, which was absolutely vicious. But within Russia itself, there were very serious legal reforms, including the reintroduction of jury trial.
What do you think is mostly responsible, if it's even possible to sum things up? I mean, of course, there's so many facets to this, but how would you characterize the primary catalyst for what we've seen happen within Russia over the last 6 to 8 to 10 years? Do you think that this is an issue of a desire to maintain this kind of caricature of Russian sovereignty, which clearly has been an important thing, at least in kind of this theoretical way, to Vladimir Putin? Or how would you assess the catalyzing factors for the recent decade or so of Russian policy?
Well, I would say the key factor is that Russia and China, of course, many Russians look at China very closely, followed very different paths. So Russia went for really dismantling the Soviet system with a wholesale attack on the Communist Party in the early years of Boris Yeltsin, really as the first step before liberalizing the economy, whereas, of course, China went the other way and kept the iron control of the Communist Party as the basis for liberalizing the economy. So very different paths. And of course, in Russia during the 1990s, there was absolute chaos with a president who was drinking a quart of vodka every day and was frequently drunk in public. So people look back at that kind of wild period of the 1990s with horror. So a lot of the secret of Putin has been that you have an individual who is sober, who presents himself as being a strong man, who's a black belt in judo. And of course, he has been very fortunate because up until very recently, we've had very high oil prices. And that has actually funded a situation in Russia where, of course, a few people get ridiculously rich, but everybody has become better off. And people have actually been paid on time until this year, when oil prices, of course, have gone through the floor. And once again in Russia, there's a very serious situation. If I could just say a word about ideology here, which is that you mentioned sovereignty, very, very important. So if you want to know what is the ideological slogan, as it were, of the regime, it is sovereignty and sovereign democracy. This is the invention of a chap called Surkov, he's a younger generation, very much the ideologist of the regime. And in 2006, a book was published called Sovereignty, edited by one of the group of young conservatives around Putin, and with chapters by Putin, Medvedev, Surkov, edited by a young conservative called Garajan. And the theoretical center of this book, bizarrely, is the thought of the Nazi legal theorist Carl Schmitt. And the central chapter is by the leading Russian expert on Carl Schmitt, who translates his work from German into Russian, called Sovereignty as a Political Choice. There you are. I think that is right at the center of the thinking of the regime in Russia at the moment.
Well, and it's fascinating because in a place as different from the United States as Russia, you still see this caricature of sovereignty and this calling card of sovereignty being used in a way that is not that different. As we've seen here in the US, groups like the Tea Party and anarcho-libertarian groups co-opting this concept of sovereignty also for their own political gain. And while the groups could not be more different than the political forces in Russia, you can't help but see the similarity there.
Well, I mean, I think it's very interesting that some of those people really admire what Putin is doing at the moment.
They do. That's actually interesting. They do admire it, yeah.
And that's because of his very pronounced conservative turn since 2012. And what I find very interesting is that Medvedev, of course, during his 4 years as president, he was ultimately under the control of Putin, nonetheless introduced some liberal reforms and brought some liberals into government. And since Putin came back in 2012, all of that is being dismantled, mostly has been dismantled. And the people Medvedev brought in have been got rid of. And there's only one left, who's the Minister of Justice, Mr. Konovalov. And really, this is a whole series of things, but amongst them, of course, social conservatism. So on the question of the attitude towards homosexuals and gays, LBTI, etc., Putin has taken a radically conservative turn, which is welcomed by many conservatives in Europe and the United States.
No question about it. We've been speaking with Professor Bill Bowring. The book is Law, Rights, and Ideology in Russia, Landmarks in the Destiny of a Great Power. Really great to have you on. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed that. Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We have a new report from the Department of Health and Human Services about the expected drop in the amount of uncompensated care at hospitals. As we know, when people don't have insurance, the hospital sends them a bill, and only a portion of that bill is ever actually collected. A new report from the Department of Health and Human Services projects that hospitals will save $5.7 billion in uncompensated care costs, specifically because of the Affordable Care Act. States that have chosen to expand Medicaid are going to see about 74% of the total savings compared to states that have not expanded Medicaid. Hospitals, here's a quote from HHS Secretary Sylvia Burwell. Hospitals have long been on the front lines of caring for the uninsured, who often cannot pay the full costs of their care. Obviously, having fewer uninsured individuals is good for everybody. That's to be expected when you have a law that contains an individual mandate. It would be completely obvious that you would see fewer people be uninsured. However, we have to remember, I disagree with the for-profit healthcare system that we have. I also believe that the Affordable Care Act has further locked in that for-profit healthcare system by providing millions and millions of new customers to for-profit insurers. I don't like that. But if you're a pro-business right-winger, you should like the fact that the Affordable Care Act is reducing the amount of care hospitals provide that they will never be paid for. It's funny, Lewis, because right-wingers seem so unilaterally opposed to the Affordable Care Act when the reality is it's a very pro-business piece of legislation that is good for hospitals. It is good for these companies that, and companies is often the right term, these for-profit companies that are providing healthcare, and they don't care. They're just against it because Obama's attached to it.
A lot of them because of that. A lot of the libertarian types just don't like mandated health care. But I'd be curious to see what these numbers look like in 5 years, in 10 years, assuming we still have the same system in place. But you're right. I want to see universal coverage. I do not want a for-profit healthcare system.
We've talked quite a bit about the problems with stop and frisk in New York City. This is the policy by which disproportionately minority individuals are stopped and frisked by police to see if they have weapons or drugs on them. I now have some data from Boston. And in Boston, African Americans make up only 25% of the population, and they represent 63% of stop and frisk stops. And we have to remember what the talking points on this are from the right. The right will say, well, David, that's okay because black people are disproportionately likely to be dealing drugs, for example. Well, we just had a study that says that's not true. Well, what about black on black violence, right? Black people are disproportionately likely to be attacked by a black person than are white people by a white person. No, we just had another report last week or the week before that tells us that's also not true. That accounting for population differences, you basically, as a white person, have the exact same probability of being aggrieved by a white person than as a black person by another black person. So as all of these memes and stereotypes fall apart, we are left yet again, Lewis, with another city in Massachusetts, supposedly the liberal bastion of Massachusetts, where you still have the disproportionate application of these policies to minorities. And you know what? I've talked about this many times. I love Massachusetts. I love New York City. There are significant problems here under the guise of a liberal and open society. Massachusetts, and particularly Boston, has a long history of racism. This was very clear during the 1960s when the great Boston Celtics teams started having more and more African-American players, including the great Bill Russell, one of my favorite players in history. And there's a long history of racism in Boston. And even now, under the umbrella of liberal and open Massachusetts, we see this as far as stop and frisk. And we know that African Americans and other minorities are very much segregated to specific parts of Boston, right? South Boston, Dorchester, etc. Even in liberal places, this is still an issue.
Boston has got to be one of the most racist places in the world. And not just now, but historically. I mean, it started with the Irish and the Italians and, all of these people were discriminated against in Boston over the years.
And then once they became white, remember at one point, Italians weren't white. The Irish weren't white. Now the Irish and Italians are white, but they have been part, along with everybody else. This is not to pinpoint them, but just to show how the oppressed can sometimes become the oppressors, for lack of a better term. We still see this perpetuated in Boston, and it is truly sad.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. But New York, New York has similar issues. And
the one thing that is better about New York is while we still have the neighborhood gentrification issue, you interact with all sorts of different people just about every day, unless you're in the top, really top income where you're constantly in a chauffeured vehicle and only in places where there are no minorities. I mean, really, you interact with a variety of people every single day.
Also, I can't help but think that these stop and frisks and racial incidents are happening all the time everywhere, but it's just because it's happening so frequently in these big population centers that we focus on those population centers. But you know what? I think it's probably happening all over the place.
Our voicemail number, 219-2-DAVID-P. Here is the former so-called coherent apologist leaving us another voicemail. What's going on in the background, I wonder?
Hi, David and Louis. This is Eleno Enzo, Bible apologist. I have a question. Are you a progressive for good or for bad? This is some example of progressive for good. Tax the rich, build high incomes, universal health care, and so on. This is some example of progressive for bad.
Right.
Support of gay marriage, for abortion, woman for leadership position, and so on. Which one is you? Thank you. Bye-bye.
I don't know what was going on in the background. I don't know if the coherent apologist works at some kind of daycare or something, or if he just has a ton of kids. I got a 12-minute video from this individual, and I'm split on whether to play parts of it on the show or not, because on the one hand, I don't want to give him attention. On the other hand, the content of the video is so stunning that I am really aching to play it. We're going to talk about it internally, and then we'll decide. On today's bonus show, another breakthrough in batteries. AMC cancels all unscripted shows in favor of more shows like Mad Men and Breaking Bad, and an infidelity radar. What is that about? Lewis will tell us on the bonus show. Go to davidpakman.com/membership to sign up today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.